Always a little hesitant to do these multi-part historical videos because they don't seem to get as much views as other things, but it's the area I really like to talk about. So, probably one of the biggest things we have to understand in terms of what is going on with Ukraine and Russia is we essentially have a group of politicians that do not know what they're doing, and overwhelmingly, most Americans don't understand the situation well enough to make an accurate call on what it is we should be doing over there. And this is one of those areas where it really calls for knowledgeable decision rather than emotional browbeating. Obviously, this is important to the American establishment because of all the other wars in the world that we've ignored. This one definitely was brought front and center. That was something we needed to be completely involved with. So, without any further introduction, I'll explain some of the history of Ukraine so that we can put things a little bit better into perspective. Okay, the first thing to know is that Ukraine has been occupied or politically controlled by Russia for a better part of 350 years. This is a map depicting the area about 1750. You can see that the area of Crimea, the little thing hanging down there in the sea, is actually part of remnants of the Mongol Empire, one of the khanates that was left over. So very actually distinctly different, because once the Russians would drive out the remnants of the Mongols slash Ottomans, they would heavily occupy it with Russians, and a big bulk of what will become Ukraine is part of Russia and part of Lithuania, Poland. And this is not to understate the sovereignty of Ukraine, is to show the complexity of what's going on in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine had several opportunities throughout history to throw off the yoke of the Russians, and every time the opportunity presented themselves, they took it very quickly. Not as much. They didn't do very well in terms of uprisings, but when political events went their way, they immediately took advantage of it. This picture depicts Kiev with Ukrainians pulling down a statue, probably of one of the czars. This is when Germany liberated Ukraine from Russia, and then Ukraine would go through a brief period where it was independent, but it was fractured and having similar civil war issues that Russia was having at the same time. Now, Crimea was a late add to the Russian Empire. And for the longest part of their history, it was considered directly part of Russia and not Ukraine, since it was taken from the remnants of the Mongol Empire and the Ottomans. Uh, the population that was there was displaced and was basically filled with Russians. The Crimean population was and still is overwhelmingly Russian. During the 1950s, as an act of goodwill, Crimea was made part of the Ukrainian SSR, part of the Soviet Union. The best way, if you wanted to think of Crimea economically, Crimea would be the rough equivalent of as what the New Orleans is to the United States. A very critical port that allows access for a large amount of goods exiting the country. This is one of the few places the Russians have decent access to the rest of the world year long. Now, over Ukraine's history, especially during the Stalin years and the years following World War II, Russification ended up placing large Russian minorities in both. Well, they were already there in. Do that just a little bit so you can see it better. They were already in Crimea, but were built up in the Donbass. And what this map depicts, the red areas are uh, Russian majorities in red. Uh, Areas where it's about 50-50 are purple, and where it's purely Ukraine or Ukrainian majority, it's the blue. So this gives you an idea of why the particular regions are in play. So when Eastern Europe spontaneously shed communism and the Berlin Wall fell, one of the things the United States agreed to in allowing Germany to reunite East and West was that NATO would not advance any further than Germany. Now, this is kind of tongue in cheek because we're showing a man handshaking with his fingers crossed behind his back. We don't know if the U.S. intention was to violate this agreement from the very beginning. It's very possible that the United States intended to uphold this agreement. In all likelihood, at that stage, people were probably uh, struggling to figure out what the new policies would be in Europe without Soviet Union dominance there messing things up. Uh, but obviously, this is an agreement that eventually was not kept. So, one of the things to keep in mind is part of the agreement of the Soviet Union starting to fall apart and recede is that the Russians agreed to bring their troops home, which they did. However, the United States, although they would draw down in Europe, they would never fully leave it. Now, strategically, this is understandable. I mean, the Russians technically weren't that far away from their old European uh, holdings, so they were in a position to move in much quicker. The United States staying behind to an extent made sense, but at the same time, it probably didn't make the Russians feel the greatest. Now, would have pulling out brought the Russians back in? You never know. But it's a simple statement of fact. The Russians pulled out, we did not. So then, in direct opposition to what we agreed to in 1999, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic were added to NATO. Now, one of the things that's understand here is that at this point, NATO isn't actually in contact with Russia. Uh, these brown countries along the edge of the east side of the map uh, are technically still a buffer zone between NATO and Russia. However, that would change when in 2004, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovenia, and Slovakia were added to NATO. Now, at this point, there were frontline NATO states actually up against Russia. And if we get this into view a little bit, not ridiculously far away from Moscow. So this actually put us in a position where we were obligated to fight on behalf of states right on the Russian border, and the Russians now had NATO troops along their border. Uh, we can argue that, yes, it's a defensive organization, but the Russians probably had doubts about how defensive things would stay in terms of moving forward in the future. In 2003, we had the Rose Revolution in Georgia. Uh, Basically, we had a series of color revolutions break out in various places around Europe. Generally, the outcome was pro-Russian governments were removed in favor of pro-Western governments. These color revolutions were financed through NGOs, non-governmental organizations. These are organizations that came in, helped ramp up their internet communications so that the people could interface with each other better, taught them how to organize, taught them general marketing concepts, all the various things that need to make a slick-looking revolution. These NGOs receive their money directly from the United States government. So the United States can play the game and say, hey, well, we weren't really involved with that. That's just those NGOs. We have nothing to do with that. Probably something similar to the logic we use that, yes, like the NIH putting money into the Wuhan lab through an intermediary where essentially they can disavow responsibility because the money changed hands twice rather than going directly to a recipient. This was not lost on the Russians. The Rose Revolution was seen as foreign meddling along their border. And then we had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. The United States spent $41 million. That was flushed into these NGOs as well. And the NGOs did the exact same thing here, where they essentially used their expertise to assist in internet communications, organization, marketing, all the things needed to make a revolution possible. So this is where I'll end this part. Next video, we'll start getting into more of the meat of what starts drawing the Ukraine and Russia into conflict with each other. So please consider smashing the like button. If you have any questions about the information I've asked, please consider asking in the comments below. If the YouTube algorithm has brought you in remotely and you're not one of my subscribers, please consider subscribing. And if you think someone might find this interesting, share it with them. Thanks for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in the next video.